Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the reservation, watching the dust settle on the gravel road where the social worker's car had disappeared. At 18, she clutched a manila envelope containing documents that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the high desert landscape of northeastern California, where the Modoc people had lived for generations. She had always known she was different. Her dark hair and eyes didn't quite match the features of the family who had raised her with such love and care. The Martinez family had never hidden the fact that she was adopted, but they had always been vague about the details. "Your birth parents couldn't take care of you," her adoptive mother Maria would say whenever Sarah asked. "But they loved you enough to give you a chance at a better life." Now, holding the envelope that contained her original birth certificate and adoption records, Sarah felt a mix of excitement and terror. The social worker, Mrs. Henderson, had explained that new laws allowed adopted children to access their records once they turned 18. Sarah had waited exactly 1 week after her birthday to make the request. The reservation stretched out before her, a place she had driven past countless times but never really explored. The Modoc tribe's modern headquarters building sat in the distance, its contemporary architecture a stark contrast to the traditional stories she had heard in school. About the Modoc War of the 1870s, she knew the basics from history class, how Captain Jack and his band of warriors had held off the U.S. Army from the lava beds, how the conflict had ended in tragedy and displacement. But this wasn't about history anymore. This was about her story. Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The first document was her original birth certificate, and there it was in black ink. Father, Thomas Crow Feather. The surname sent a jolt through her chest. She recognized it immediately. The Crow Feather family was prominent on the reservation. She had seen the name on signs in the local newspaper and heard it mentioned in conversations around town. Her birth mother was listed as Jennifer Running Bear, a name that meant nothing to her. But Thomas Crow Feather, everyone knew that family. They owned one of the largest cattle ranches in the area and had significant influence in both tribal and local politics. The current patriarch, she recalled, was an elderly man named William Crow Feather, who often appeared in the newspaper for various community events and business dealings. Sarah's hands shook as she read further through the documents. There were details about the circumstances of her birth, notes from social workers, and medical records. Her birth mother had been young, only 16 at the time. The father was listed as 21. There were mentions of family pressure, cultural expectations, and a decision made in the best interests of all parties involved. What struck her most was a handwritten note tucked between the official documents. It was brief, written in careful cursive. "My daughter, if you ever read this, know that letting you go was the hardest thing I ever had to do. But our family's reputation? Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. I hope you have found happiness. Your father, TCF." The note was dated just 3 days after her birth. Sarah read it again and again, trying to understand what dangerous secrets her father had been referring to. What could have been so threatening to the family's reputation that they would give up their own child? She folded the documents carefully and placed them back in the envelope. The reservation suddenly felt different to her now. Not just a place she had driven past, but a place where she belonged, where her blood relatives lived and worked and carried on their daily lives. Somewhere out there was her birth father, Thomas Crow Feather, and possibly other family members who didn't even know she existed. The weight of the discovery settled on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. For 18 years, she had wondered about her origins, created stories in her mind about who her birth parents might be, and why they had given her up. The reality was more complex than any story she had imagined. Sarah walked back to her car, a used Honda Civic that had seen better days. She sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring out at the reservation and thinking about what to do next. Should she try to contact Thomas Crow Feather directly? Should she approach the tribal offices and ask for information? Or should she do more research first? Try to understand what she was getting herself into. The afternoon was growing late and she needed to get home. Maria Martinez would be expecting her for dinner, and Sarah hadn't told her adoptive family about her decision to seek out her birth records. She wasn't sure how they would react. The Martinez family had been nothing but loving and supportive, and she didn't want them to think she was ungrateful or that they hadn't been enough for her. As she drove home through the familiar streets of her small town, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities and fears. What if Thomas Crowfeather didn't want to see her? What if the dangerous secret he had mentioned in his note was something that would hurt people if it came to light? What if she opened a door that was better left closed? But despite her fears, she felt a growing sense of determination. She had lived her entire life with questions about where she came from, and now she finally had some answers and a path forward. Whatever the consequences, she needed to know the truth about her origins and about the secret that had been deemed too dangerous to keep 18 years ago. The sun was setting behind the mountains as Sarah pulled into the driveway of the small house where she had grown up. Maria Martinez was watering flowers in the front yard, and she waved as Sarah approached. Her adoptive mother's warm smile was the same one that had greeted her every day for as long as she could remember. "How was your day, mija?" Maria asked, using the Spanish term of endearment she had always used. "Good, Mom," Sarah replied, tucking the envelope under her arm. "Just thinking about some things." Maria nodded, perhaps sensing that Sarah wasn't ready to share whatever was on her mind. "Well, dinner will be ready soon. Your father will be home from work any minute." As Sarah walked into the house that had been her sanctuary for 18 years, she realized that no matter what she discovered about her birth family, this would always be home. But she also knew that her journey to uncover the truth about Thomas Crowfeather and his dangerous secret was just beginning. 3 days had passed since Sarah discovered the truth about her birth father, and she had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that handwritten note with its cryptic message about dangerous secrets. She had spent hours researching the Crowfeather family online, learning everything she could before making any contact. What she found both impressed and intimidated her. The Crowfeather family had been prominent in the region for over a century. William Crowfeather, who she calculated must be Thomas's father and therefore her grandfather, was now 73 years old and still actively involved in running the family's extensive cattle operation. The ranch covered thousands of acres and employed dozens of people from both the reservation and the surrounding communities. Thomas Crowfeather, her birth father, was now 39 years old and worked as the ranch's general manager. Online photos showed a tall, serious-looking man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. In several newspaper articles about local business and tribal affairs, he was described as a respected member of the community who was being groomed to eventually take over the family enterprise. But what caught Sarah's attention most was what she didn't find. Unlike his father, who appeared frequently in local news and social media, Thomas seemed to maintain a much lower profile. There were very few photos of him, and he rarely gave interviews or made public statements. For someone in such a prominent family, he seemed almost deliberately invisible. Sarah had also discovered that Thomas had never married. At 39, he lived alone in a house on the ranch property, separate from the main family residence where William still lived. This detail puzzled her. In a traditional family structure, especially one with such extensive land and business holdings, she would have expected him to have a wife and children by now. On Thursday morning, Sarah made a decision. She called in sick to her part-time job at the local grocery store and drove to the reservation. She had no specific plan, but she felt compelled to see the place where her birth father lived and worked. Maybe she would find the courage to approach him directly, or maybe she would just observe from a distance and try to understand more about the world she had come from. The Crowfeather Ranch was easy to find. A large wooden sign marked the entrance to a long driveway that wound through rolling hills dotted with cattle. Sarah parked her car on the public road and walked to a spot where she could see the ranch buildings in the distance. The main house was an impressive 2-story structure that looked like it had been built in the early 1900s but had been well maintained and updated over the years. She could see several other buildings, barns, equipment sheds, and what appeared to be worker housing. In one of the corrals, she spotted a man working with a horse. Even from a distance, she could tell he was tall and moved with the easy confidence of someone who had been around animals his entire life. Her heart started pounding. Could that be Thomas, her birth father? Sarah found herself walking closer, drawn by an irresistible need to see him more clearly. She stayed on the public road but moved to a point where the view was better. The man in the corral was definitely the same person she had seen in the online photos. Thomas Crowfeather was working patiently with a young horse, speaking to it in low, calm tones that she couldn't quite hear from her distance. She watched for nearly an hour, mesmerized by this first real glimpse of her birth father. He moved with a quiet authority that reminded her of some of her teachers, people who commanded respect not through aggression, but through competence and self-assurance. When he finished with the horse, he walked toward one of the barns and Sarah lost sight of him. It was then that she noticed the pickup truck approaching on the ranch road. It slowed as it passed her position, and she saw an elderly man behind the wheel studying her with obvious curiosity. The truck stopped and the man rolled down his window. "You lost, young lady?" he called out. His voice was gravelly but not unfriendly. Sarah's throat went dry. She was almost certain this was William Crow Feather, her grandfather, though he didn't know it. "No, sir," she managed to say. "Just looking at the countryside." William studied her for a long moment, and Sarah felt as though he was seeing something that made him uncomfortable. His weathered face showed a flicker of recognition or perhaps confusion that made her wonder if there was something familiar about her appearance. "This is private property," he said finally. "The road's public, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't linger too long. We've had some problems with people taking photos and posting them online without permission." "Of course," Sarah said quickly. "I'm sorry. I'll move along." But William didn't drive away immediately. He continued to stare at her with an expression that seemed part puzzlement, part concern. "Have we met before?" he asked. "You look familiar." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted desperately to tell him who she was, to explain that she was his granddaughter, that she belonged here in a way he couldn't imagine. But something held her back. Perhaps the memory of that note about dangerous secrets, or perhaps simple fear of rejection. "I don't think so," she said. "I'm from town. You might have seen me at the grocery store where I work." William nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. "Maybe," he said. "You take care now." He drove away, but Sarah noticed that he looked back at her several times in his rearview mirror. She waited until the truck disappeared around a bend in the ranch road before walking back to her car. Her hands were shaking as she fumbled with her keys. The encounter had shaken her more than she expected. There had been something in William's eyes, a recognition that went beyond casual familiarity. Did she really look that much like someone in the family? Could he have suspected who she was? As she drove back toward town, Sarah's mind raced with new questions and possibilities. What would have happened if she had told William the truth? Would he have welcomed her as a long-lost granddaughter? Or would he have been angry that she had disturbed the family's carefully maintained silence about her existence? She thought about Thomas working with the horse, his patient and gentle manner. He didn't look like someone harboring dangerous secrets, but then again, she had no idea what those secrets might involve. Could they be related to the circumstances of her birth? Or was there something else? Something that went deeper into the family's history and relationships. That evening, Sarah sat in her room with the adoption documents spread out on her desk. She read through them again, looking for clues she might have missed. There were references to family consultation and tribal council involvement that suggested her birth and subsequent adoption had been more than just a personal decision between two young people. One document mentioned that both birth parents had agreed to maintain confidentiality regarding the circumstances of conception and birth. This phrase struck her as oddly formal, more like legal language than something that would typically appear in adoption paperwork. It made her wonder if there had been some kind of scandal or controversy surrounding her birth that went beyond the usual concerns about teenage pregnancy. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began searching for more information about the Modoc tribe's customs and traditions regarding children born outside of marriage. What she found suggested that while such situations were not uncommon, they were typically handled within the extended family structure, rather than through outside adoption. The fact that she had been placed with a non-native family, despite the Indian Child Welfare Act's preference for keeping native children within tribal communities, suggested that there had been compelling reasons for the decision, reasons that might be connected to the dangerous secret her birth father had mentioned in his note. As midnight approached, Sarah made another decision. She would not approach Thomas directly, at least not yet. Instead, she would try to learn more about what had happened 18 years ago. She would talk to people who might remember the circumstances of her birth, research tribal records if possible, and try to understand what kind of secret could be so dangerous that it would tear a family apart. Sarah spent the weekend gathering courage for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. On Monday morning, she drove to the tribal headquarters, a modern building that served as the administrative center for the Modoc nation. She had decided that if she was going to uncover the truth about her birth and the mysterious secret her father had mentioned, she needed to start with official records. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, greeted her warmly. "How can I help you today?" "I'm looking for information about my birth family," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was adopted 18 years ago and I recently received my birth records. I was hoping someone here might remember the circumstances or could help me understand what happened." The receptionist's expression shifted to one of professional sympathy. "That's a sensitive matter. Let me see if Margaret Littlewolf is available. She's our family services coordinator and has worked here for over 20 years. If anyone would remember something from that time, it would be her." A few minutes later, Sarah found herself sitting across from Margaret Littlewolf in a small office decorated with traditional Modoc artwork and family photos. Margaret was probably in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and a face that had seen both joy and sorrow. "Tell me what you know," Margaret said gently, pouring Sarah a cup of coffee from a thermos on her desk. Sarah explained about receiving her adoption records and discovering that Thomas Crow Feather was her birth father. She mentioned the note he had written about dangerous secrets, but didn't go into detail about her recent surveillance of the ranch. Margaret's expression grew increasingly serious as Sarah spoke. When she finished, Margaret sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "I remember," Margaret said finally. "It was a very difficult situation for everyone involved. I was newer to this job then, but I worked on your case with the previous family services coordinator." "Can you tell me what happened?" Sarah asked. "Why was I placed with a non-native family instead of staying within the tribal community?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "There were complications. Your birth mother, Jennifer Running Bear, was very young, just 16, and there were concerns about the family dynamics that went beyond the usual challenges of teenage pregnancy." "What kind of concerns?" Margaret hesitated. "Sarah, I need you to understand that some of what I'm about to tell you involves other people's privacy, but I think you have a right to know the basic facts about your own origins." She pulled out a file cabinet and retrieved a thick folder. "Your birth mother came from a troubled family situation. Her father had a serious drinking problem, and there had been incidents of domestic violence. When she became pregnant, she was afraid to tell her family at first. And my birth father, Thomas? Thomas was a different story entirely," Margaret said, and Sarah noticed a subtle change in her tone. "He was 21, from one of the most respected families on the reservation. When Jennifer finally told him about the pregnancy, he wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to marry her and raise the child together. So what stopped them?" Margaret looked directly at Sarah, her eyes reflecting an old sadness. "His family stopped them. William Crow Feather specifically. But it wasn't because of Jennifer's age or her family situation, though those were the reasons they gave publicly." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "What was the real reason?" "Jennifer's grandmother, who died about 10 years ago, told me something in confidence that I've never repeated to anyone. She said that William Crow Feather had a very specific reason for preventing the marriage, something that had to do with bloodlines and family history." The way Margaret said bloodlines sent a chill through Sarah. "I don't understand." Margaret opened the file and pulled out a document that looked much older than the others. "This is a family genealogy that Jennifer's grandmother provided during the adoption process. She insisted that we include it in your file even though it seemed irrelevant at the time." Sarah took the document and studied it. It was a hand-drawn family tree that went back several generations. She found Jennifer Running Bear's name and traced the lines upward to her ancestors. Most of the names meant nothing to her, but one made her stop breathing for a moment. 3 generations back, Jennifer's family tree included the name Mary Crow Feather. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "Jennifer's great-great-grandmother was William Crow Feather's great-aunt," Margaret explained quietly. "It's a distant relationship, but in a small tribal community, family connections like that are taken seriously by some of the older generation." Sarah stared at the family tree, trying to process what this meant. So Thomas and Jennifer were related. Distantly, yes. It's not uncommon in small communities. and it certainly wasn't close enough to be genetically concerning. But William Crow Feather comes from a very traditional background. He believed that certain bloodlines should not mix, that doing so would bring dishonor to both families. "That's ridiculous," Sarah said, anger rising in her voice. "They weren't even close relatives." "I agree," Margaret said. So did most people involved in the situation. But William had significant influence not just in his own family, but in the tribal council. He made it clear that if Thomas married Jennifer and kept the baby, there would be serious consequences for Thomas's future role in the family business and his standing in the community. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. "So they gave me away because of some old man's prejudices about bloodlines?" "It was more complicated than that," Margaret said gently. "Jennifer was young and scared, and her own family was pushing her to give the baby up for adoption because they couldn't handle the additional stress in their household. Thomas was torn between his love for Jennifer and you and his obligations to his family and his future." "What about Jennifer? What happened to her?" Margaret's expression grew even sadder. "She left the reservation shortly after you were born. She couldn't handle the shame and the gossip. Last I heard, she was living somewhere in Oregon and had lost touch with her family here." Sarah absorbed this information, feeling a complex mix of anger, sadness, and understanding. Her birth parents hadn't abandoned her carelessly. They had been forced apart by circumstances and pressures that were beyond their control. "Does Thomas know that you're telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Thomas doesn't know you're here," Margaret replied. "But I think he has a right to know that you exist and that you're looking for answers. The question is whether you're ready to face the consequences of that conversation." "What kind of consequences?" Margaret leaned forward in her chair. "William Crow Feather is still alive and still very much in control of his family's affairs. If he finds out that you've returned and that Thomas might want a relationship with you, it could create the same kind of conflict that separated your birth parents 18 years ago." Sarah thought about her encounter with William at the ranch, the way he had looked at her with that puzzled recognition. "I think he might already suspect something," she said, and told Margaret about their brief conversation. Margaret's eyebrows rose. "That could complicate things. William is not someone who likes surprises or challenges to his authority. If he thinks you might disrupt the family's carefully maintained reputation and traditions, he'll take steps to prevent it." "What kind of steps?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "But I do know that he spent 18 years believing that the problem of your existence was resolved. Learning that you're back and asking questions might motivate him to take more drastic action to protect what he sees as his family's honor." Sarah felt a chill of fear, but also a growing determination. "So what do you think I should do?" Margaret studied her for a long moment. "That's a decision you have to make for yourself. But whatever you decide, you should be prepared for the possibility that seeking the truth might hurt people you care about, including Thomas, who has spent 18 years trying to live with the choice he was forced to make." As Sarah left the tribal headquarters that afternoon, she carried with her a much clearer picture of what had happened 18 years ago, but she also carried a heavier burden of responsibility. She now understood that her quest for answers could potentially destroy the fragile peace that her birth father had built for himself, and that there were people who would go to great lengths to prevent her from disrupting the status quo. The dangerous secret wasn't just about her birth, it was about the ongoing tension between tradition and change, family loyalty and personal freedom, that continue to shape life on the reservation even today. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's conversation with Margaret Littlewolf, and she had been avoiding any decision about contacting Thomas directly. Instead, she threw herself into research, spending hours at the local library and online, learning everything she could about Modoc history, traditions, and the specific families involved in her story. What she discovered both fascinated and frustrated her. The Modoc people had survived centuries of displacement, conflict, and cultural suppression, maintaining their identity through sheer determination and the strength of family bonds. Yet here was her own family, torn apart by the very traditions that were supposed to protect and preserve their heritage. She learned that marriage customs among the Modoc had traditionally been complex, with careful attention paid to clan relationships and family alliances. But the rigid interpretation that William Crow Feather had applied to her parents' situation seemed extreme even by traditional standards. The more she read, the more convinced she became that his opposition had been about power and control, rather than genuine cultural concerns. On a Thursday evening, Sarah was working the late shift at the grocery store when she saw a familiar pickup truck pull into the parking lot. Her heart started racing as she recognized William Crow Feather climbing out of the driver's seat. He moved slowly, using a walking cane that she hadn't noticed during their previous encounter at the ranch. William walked through the automatic doors and began shopping, taking his time in each aisle. Sarah tried to focus on her work at the checkout counter, but she was acutely aware of his presence. Several times she caught him looking in her direction, and she wondered if he had come here specifically to see her. When he finally approached her checkout lane, Sarah's hands were trembling as she scanned his items. Basic groceries, nothing unusual. They made small talk about the weather while she worked, both of them dancing around the obvious tension between them. "You're the young lady I met out by the ranch a couple weeks ago," William said as she bagged his groceries. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, not trusting herself to say more. William studied her face again with that same puzzled expression. "I've been thinking about you since then. You remind me of someone, but I can't quite place who." Sarah's throat felt dry. This was her chance to tell him the truth, to explain who she was and why she had been watching the ranch. But something in his eyes stopped her, a wariness that suggested he already suspected more than he was letting on. "I have one of those faces," she said weakly. William paid for his groceries, but he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he stood there studying her for another long moment. "What did you say your name was?" "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Martinez." "Martinez," he repeated slowly. "That's the family that lives over on Pine Street, isn't it? The ones who took in that adopted child years ago." Sarah's blood turned to ice. He knew. Somehow William Crowfeather had figured out exactly who she was. Yes, that's my family," she managed to say. William nodded slowly and his expression grew cold. "I thought so. You have your father's eyes." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. There was no mistaking the implication. William knew she was Thomas's daughter and he was not happy about her presence in his world. "Mr. Crowfeather, No," he said firmly, cutting her off. "Whatever you think you're doing, whatever you think you're going to accomplish by coming around here, you need to stop. Some doors are meant to stay closed, but I just want to understand. You want to understand." William's voice rose slightly, drawing attention from other customers. "Let me help you understand. 18 years ago, some very difficult decisions were made by people who loved you enough to do what was best for everyone involved. Those decisions should be respected." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. What was best for everyone? Or what was best for you? William's face hardened. "Watch your tone, young lady. You don't know anything about what this family has been through or what we've sacrificed to maintain our position in this community. I know that you separated two people who loved each other and gave away their child because you were worried about some distant family connection that didn't even matter." The words came out louder than Sarah had intended, and she noticed that other customers were starting to stare. William glanced around and then leaned closer to her, lowering his voice to an angry whisper. "You think this is about bloodlines? You think this is about some old tribal custom?" He shook his head.
"You have no idea what you're talking about."
"There are things about your birth, about your parents' relationship that you don't understand and don't need to understand." "Then tell me," Sarah said desperately. "Help me understand why I couldn't be part of my own family." William straightened up, and for a moment his angry expression softened into something that might have been sadness. "Because some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some truths are too painful to live with. Your father knew that when he wrote you that note, and he made the right choice by letting you go." He picked up his grocery bags and started to walk away, but then stopped and turned back to her. "Stay away from the ranch, Sarah. Stay away from Thomas. If you care about him at all, you'll leave him alone to live his life in peace." After William left, Sarah stood behind the checkout counter in a daze. The other customers resumed their shopping, but she felt as though everyone was still watching her. Her supervisor approached to ask if she was okay, and she mumbled something about feeling sick and asked to go home early. Sarah drove home in a state of emotional turmoil. William's warning had been clear, but it had also raised more questions than it answered. What secrets was he talking about? What truth was so painful that it justified tearing a family apart? When she arrived home, she found Maria Martinez waiting for her in the kitchen with a cup of tea and a concerned expression. "Mija, we need to talk," Maria said gently. Sarah's heart sank. About what? About whatever has been troubling you these past few weeks. About the envelope you've been carrying around and the research you've been doing on your computer. About the phone call I got from Margaret Littlewolf this afternoon. Sarah slumped into a chair at the kitchen table. Margaret called you? She was worried about you. She said you had come to the tribal offices asking questions about your birth family, and she wanted to make sure you had support at home for whatever you might discover. Maria reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. I know you've been curious about your birth parents your whole life. Your father and I always expected that you would want to search for them someday, but we're worried that you might be getting into a situation that's more complicated and potentially harmful than you realize. How much do you know about what happened when I was born? Sarah asked. Maria sighed. More than we told you, but not everything. The social worker who handled your adoption was very clear that there were unusual circumstances surrounding your case. She said that your birth parents had wanted to keep you, but that family and tribal politics had made it impossible. Did you know that my birth father is Thomas Crowfeather? Maria nodded. We knew, and we knew that his family had significant influence in the community. We were told that there could be complications if they ever found out where you had been placed. Sarah felt a surge of anger. So you knew all along and you never told me? We were protecting you, Maria said firmly. Just like we promised your birth parents we would. Sarah, the Crowfeather family has money and power that extends far beyond the reservation. If they had wanted to cause problems for us, they could have made our lives very difficult. But Thomas wanted to keep me. You just said so yourself. Thomas was 21 years old and had no power in his family's decision-making. William Crowfeather made it clear that if we ever allowed contact between you and Thomas, there would be consequences for all of us. Sarah stared at her adoptive mother, trying to process this new information. So you've been living in fear of them for 18 years? Not fear, Maria corrected. Caution, and respect for an agreement that we made when we adopted you. An agreement that we would raise you as our own and not interfere with the family's desire to keep the circumstances of your birth private. Well, that agreement is broken now, Sarah said. William knows who I am. He confronted me at work tonight. Maria's face went pale. What did he say? Sarah recounted her conversation with William, including his warning to stay away from Thomas and his cryptic references to dangerous secrets and painful truths. When she finished, Maria was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Sarah, there's something else you need to know. Something that Margaret probably doesn't know because it wasn't in any of the official records. What? Maria took a deep breath. The night before your adoption was finalized, Thomas came to our house. He wanted to see you one last time before we took you home. He held you for about an hour and he cried. I had never seen a grown man cry like that. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. He told us that giving you up was the hardest thing he had ever done, but that he had no choice. He said that if he tried to fight his father's decision, it would destroy not just his own life, but yours and your birth mother's as well. He made us promise that if you ever came looking for him, we would make sure you understood that he never stopped loving you. The weight of this revelation settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. Her birth father had loved her, had wanted to keep her, but had been forced to give her up by circumstances beyond his control. And now, 18 years later, those same forces were still at work, trying to keep them apart. Sarah spent the next few days in an emotional fog, trying to process everything she had learned from Maria. The image of Thomas holding her as a baby, crying as he said goodbye, haunted her thoughts. She found herself wondering what her life might have been like if William Crowfeather hadn't interfered. If her birth parents had been allowed to raise her together. On Saturday morning, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of continuing to investigate from a distance, she would find a way to speak with Thomas directly. She needed to hear his side of the story, to understand what the dangerous secret really was, and to let him know that she didn't blame him for the choice he had been forced to make. Sarah had learned from her research that Thomas often attended the weekly farmers market in the town square, where the ranch sold beef and other products. It was a public place where she could approach him without trespassing on family property, or creating a scene that might get back to William. She arrived at the market early, before the crowds gathered, and spotted the Crowfeather Ranch booth easily. Thomas was there with a younger man she didn't recognize, arranging packages of meat in a refrigerated display case. He looked older than in the photos she had found online, with more gray in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but there was no mistaking his identity. Sarah bought a cup of coffee from a nearby vendor and positioned herself where she could observe Thomas without being obvious about it. She watched him interact with customers, noting his quiet demeanor and the respectful way people spoke to him. He clearly had a reputation in the community, though she sensed that people kept a certain distance from him, perhaps out of deference to his family's status, or perhaps for reasons she didn't yet understand. As the morning progressed, the crowd thinned out and Sarah saw her opportunity. She approached the booth when Thomas was alone, the younger man having left to load supplies into their truck. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely steady. "Are you Thomas Crowfeather?" He looked up from arranging the remaining packages of meat, and Sarah saw immediate recognition in his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally a deep sadness that made Sarah's heart ache. "You're Sarah," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she replied. "I got my adoption records a few weeks ago. I've been trying to understand what happened when I was born." Thomas glanced around the market, checking to see if anyone was watching them. "We can't talk here," he said urgently. "My father has people who report back to him about everything I do." "Then where?" Sarah asked. "I need to talk to you. I need to understand." Thomas hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to speak with her and his fear of the consequences. "There's a coffee shop on the edge of town near the highway. Murphy's Diner. Can you meet me there in an hour?" "Yes," Sarah said immediately. "Come alone," Thomas added. "And if anyone asks, we never spoke." An hour later, Sarah sat in a corner booth at Murphy's Diner, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the door. The diner was nearly empty, just a few truckers and an elderly couple having breakfast. When Thomas arrived, he looked around carefully before joining her in the booth. Up close, Sarah could see that he had her eyes, the same dark brown color and similar shape. There were other resemblances, too, in the curve of his jaw and the way he held his shoulders. For the first time in her life, she was looking at someone who shared her DNA, and the effect was overwhelming. "I can't believe you're here," Thomas said, his voice filled with wonder and pain. "I can't believe you're real. For 18 years, I've wondered what you looked like, whether you were happy, whether you ever thought about me." "I thought about you every day," Sarah said. "I always wondered why you gave me away, whether you loved me, whether you ever regretted it." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "Regretted it? Sarah, giving you up was the biggest mistake of my life. Not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted it. But I was young and scared, and I let my father convince me that it was the only choice. Your father told me there were dangerous secrets, painful truths, that justified separating our family." "What was he talking about?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The secret isn't what you think it is. It's not about bloodlines or tribal traditions. Those were just excuses my father used to justify his real reason for breaking us up." "Then what was it really about?" Thomas looked directly at her, and Sarah saw a pain in his eyes that went deeper than the loss of a child. "Your mother, Jennifer, she wasn't just some teenager who got pregnant by accident. We had been together for over a year. We were in love and we had talked about getting married even before she got pregnant." "So what was the problem?" "The problem was that my father had already arranged for me to marry someone else, the daughter of another prominent family, someone who would strengthen our political and business connections in the region. When he found out about Jennifer and the pregnancy, he saw it as a threat to his plans for my future." Sarah felt a chill of understanding. "So he used the distant family connection as an excuse to break you up?" "Exactly. He told everyone, the tribal council, the social workers, even Jennifer's family, that the relationship violated traditional customs about family bloodlines. But really, he just wanted me available to marry the woman he had chosen for me." "Did you marry her?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from her research. Thomas shook his head. "No, I couldn't go through with it. After losing you and Jennifer, I couldn't bring myself to enter into a marriage that was just a business arrangement. My father was furious, but by then it was too late. The other family had lost interest, and I had developed a reputation for being unreliable. Is that why you never married anyone?" "Partly," Thomas admitted, "but also because I never got over Jennifer. I spent years hoping she would come back. that we could find a way to be together and maybe even find you. But she never returned to the reservation. I heard she got married to someone in Oregon and started a new life. Sarah absorbed this information, feeling a complex mix of sadness and anger. So we were all sacrificed for a marriage that never even happened? Yes, Thomas said bitterly. My father destroyed 3 lives to preserve his vision of what our family should be, and in the end he got nothing he wanted. I never married the woman he chose, never had the children he wanted to carry on the family name, never became the dutiful son he had planned for. What about now? Sarah asked. What if we tried to have a relationship now? I'm an adult. He can't control your life anymore. Thomas's expression grew troubled. You don't understand how much power he still has, not just over me, but over the entire community. The ranch employs dozens of people, and our family contributes to tribal programs, local charities, political campaigns. If he wanted to make life difficult for you and your adoptive family, he could do it. But I'm not asking you to choose between me and your responsibilities, Sarah said. I just want to know you. I want to understand where I came from and maybe have some kind of relationship with my birth father. Thomas reached across the table and took her hand, the first physical contact they had shared since she was a baby. I want that too, he said. More than you can imagine, but you need to understand what you're asking. My father isn't just going to ignore your presence. If he thinks you're a threat to the family's reputation or his control over me, he'll take action to neutralize that threat. What kind of action? I don't know, Thomas admitted. But I know he's capable of things that would surprise you. The gentle old rancher that people see in public isn't the same man who rules his family with an iron fist. He spent 60 years building and protecting his empire, and he won't let anyone, not even his own granddaughter, threaten what he's created. Sarah felt a chill of fear, but also a growing determination. So what do we do? Do we just pretend this conversation never happened? Do I go back to my life and forget that I ever found you? Thomas was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, he spoke in a voice filled with resolve. No. I've lived with regret for 18 years and I'm tired of letting fear control my choices. If you're willing to accept the risks, then I want to try to build a relationship with you, but we'll have to be careful, and we'll have to be prepared for the consequences when my father finds out. As they left the diner separately, Sarah felt both hope and apprehension about what lay ahead. She had finally connected with her birth father, but she also understood that their reunion was likely to trigger a conflict that had been simmering for 18 years. The dangerous secret was finally beginning to reveal itself, and it was more about power and control than anyone had imagined. For 2 weeks after their meeting at Murphy's Diner, Sarah and Thomas managed to maintain secret contact through carefully planned encounters. They met at different locations around the county: a park in a neighboring town, a hiking trail away from the reservation, a bookstore where Thomas sometimes went to research cattle breeding techniques. Each meeting deepened their connection and helped heal some of the wounds that had festered for 18 years. Sarah learned that Thomas was nothing like the distant, business-focused man she had imagined from newspaper articles. He was gentle and thoughtful, with a deep love of the land and animals that reminded her of her own connection to nature. He told her stories about Modoc traditions, taught her words in their native language, and shared memories of her birth mother that painted a picture of a smart, funny young woman who had loved literature and dreamed of becoming a teacher. Thomas, in turn, was amazed by the person Sarah had become. He was proud of her academic achievements, her work ethic, and the strong moral compass that the Martinez family had instilled in her. He often said that she had gotten the best of both worlds: her birth parents' intelligence and creativity, combined with the stability and love that Maria and Roberto Martinez had provided. But their careful secrecy couldn't last forever. On a Thursday afternoon, as Sarah was leaving her job at the grocery store, she noticed a black SUV following her. She had seen the same vehicle parked outside her house that morning, and again during her lunch break. Someone was watching her, and she had a good idea who had ordered the surveillance. That evening, she called Thomas from a payphone at a gas station, something they had agreed to do only in emergencies. "I think your father has someone following me," she said without preamble. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid this might happen. He's been asking questions about my schedule, wanting to know why I've been leaving the ranch more often lately. What should we do? We need to be more careful." Maybe we should stop meeting for a while until things cool down. But Sarah had been thinking about their situation, and she had reached a different conclusion. Thomas, I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending that I don't exist, that our relationship is something shameful that has to be kept secret. What if we just told him the truth? Sarah, you don't understand what you're suggesting. My father isn't going to have a rational conversation about this. When he finds out that we've been meeting, he's going to see it as a betrayal and a threat. Then let him. I'm not afraid of him anymore. But Sarah's bravery was tested the next morning, when she found William Crowfeather sitting in his pickup truck outside her house at 6 a.m. He was waiting for her when she left for work, and he followed her to the grocery store. When she arrived, he got out of his truck and approached her before she could get inside the building. We need to talk, he said, his voice cold and authoritative. I don't think we have anything to discuss, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Oh, but we do. We need to discuss your recent activities and how they're affecting my family. William gestured toward a coffee shop across the street. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Against her better judgment, Sarah agreed. She wanted to understand what he knew and what he was planning to do about it. They sat across from each other in a booth near the window, and William wasted no time getting to the point. I know you've been meeting with Thomas, he said. I know you've been filling his head with ideas about having a relationship with you. He's my father, Sarah said simply. We have a right to know each other. He's not your father, William snapped. He donated genetic material 18 years ago. That doesn't make him your father. The man who raised you, who paid for your food and clothing and education, he's your father. I love my adoptive parents. But that doesn't change the fact that Thomas is my biological father, and that he was forced to give me up because of your interference. William's face darkened. My interference? Young lady, you have no idea what you're talking about. The decisions that were made 18 years ago were made to protect everyone involved, including you. Protect us from what? William leaned forward, his eyes intense. From the truth about what really happened between Thomas and your birth mother. From the scandal that would have destroyed both families if it had become public. Sarah felt her heart racing. What truth? What scandal? William studied her face for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Jennifer Running Bear wasn't just some innocent teenager who got pregnant by accident. She was involved in activities that could have brought serious legal trouble to anyone associated with her. What kind of activities? Drug dealing, William said bluntly. Her boyfriend before Thomas was a meth dealer who was bringing drugs onto the reservation. Jennifer was helping him, acting as a go-between with customers. When she started seeing Thomas, she tried to get him involved too. Sarah felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. That's not true. Thomas was young and in love, and he made some very poor decisions. He didn't deal drugs himself, but he knew what Jennifer was doing, and he didn't stop her. He even helped her once or twice when she needed transportation. I don't believe you. William pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph. It was clearly taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, but Sarah could make out two figures standing next to a car. One was unmistakably a young Thomas, and the other was a young woman who must have been Jennifer. This was taken by a private investigator I hired when I started getting suspicious about Thomas's relationship with Jennifer. She's handing him a package that we later determined contained methamphetamines. Sarah stared at the photograph, trying to process what she was seeing. Even if this is true, it doesn't justify breaking up their relationship and taking their child away, doesn't it? William's voice was harsh. Do you know what would have happened if this had come to light? Thomas would have been arrested as an accessory to drug trafficking. Jennifer was already under investigation by the FBI. If they had gotten married and tried to raise you together, you would have grown up visiting your parents in federal prison. So instead you covered it up and made the problem disappear. I made a deal, William said. I convinced the investigators that Thomas was an innocent victim who had been manipulated by Jennifer. In exchange for their silence and Jennifer's cooperation in their investigation of her previous boyfriend, the charges against Thomas were dropped and Jennifer was allowed to leave the state without prosecution. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. And the price for this deal was giving me up for adoption? The price was ending the relationship between Thomas and Jennifer permanently. Your adoption was Jennifer's idea. She knew that she couldn't provide a stable home for a child while she was trying to rebuild her life, and she wanted you to have opportunities that she couldn't give you. Does Thomas know that you're telling me this? William's expression grew even more serious. Thomas doesn't know that I'm here, and he doesn't know the full extent of what I did to protect him 18 years ago. He thinks the breakup was about tribal traditions and family bloodlines because that's what I told him. He doesn't know about the drug investigation or the deal I made with the FBI. Sarah felt as though her entire understanding of the situation had been turned upside down. Why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to understand what's at stake. If you continue pursuing this relationship with Thomas, if you start asking questions and drawing attention to what happened 18 years ago, you could reopen an investigation that would destroy him. The statute of limitations hasn't run out on federal drug charges. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you, William said. I'm an old man and I won't be around much longer to protect my family. But there are people who remember what happened back then. People who would be very interested to learn that Thomas Crowfeather is back in contact with Jennifer Running Bear's daughter. Sarah stood up from the booth, her legs shaky. I need time to think about this. You do that, William said. But while you're thinking, remember that Thomas has spent 18 years building a respectable life. He's a good man who made some mistakes when he was young. Don't destroy him just because you want to satisfy your curiosity about your origins. As Sarah walked back to her car, her mind was reeling with questions and doubts. Was William telling the truth about the drug investigation? Or was this just another manipulation designed to keep her away from Thomas? And if it was true, what did it mean for her relationship with her birth father and her understanding of her own origins? The dangerous secret was becoming more dangerous than she had ever imagined, and she was beginning to understand why some doors were meant to stay closed. Sarah spent 3 agonizing days wrestling with William's revelations before deciding she had to confront Thomas with what she had learned. The photograph of him with Jennifer and the drug package haunted her thoughts, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than William had revealed. She needed to hear Thomas's version of events before making any decisions about their relationship. She called him from the same payphone and arranged to meet at a remote spot near a lake outside of town. When she arrived, Thomas was already there, sitting on a fallen log and throwing stones into the water. He looked up as she approached, and she could see immediately that something was wrong. My father told me about your conversation, he said without preamble. He said he had to tell you the truth about what happened 18 years ago. Sarah sat down beside him, unsure how to begin. Is it true? About Jennifer and the drugs? Thomas was quiet for a long time, continuing to throw stones into the lake. It's true, he said finally, but it's not the whole truth. Then tell me the whole truth. Thomas took a deep breath and looked directly at her. Jennifer wasn't a drug dealer. She was an addict. Her previous boyfriend had gotten her hooked on methamphetamines, and when I met her, she was trying to get clean, but struggling with withdrawal and cravings. Sarah felt a mix of relief and sadness. This painted a very different picture from the one William had presented. I was trying to help her, Thomas continued. I was young and naive, and I thought love could fix everything. When she relapsed, I would drive her to meetings with her dealer because I was afraid she would do something dangerous if she went alone. I thought I was protecting her, but I was really just enabling her addiction. The photograph William showed me was real, Thomas admitted. I was picking up drugs for Jennifer because she was too sick to leave the house. It was stupid and illegal, and I knew it was wrong, but I was desperate to help her get through what I thought was just a rough patch. Sarah absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with her growing understanding of her birth parents' story. What happened when Jennifer found out she was pregnant? She panicked at first, but then she got serious about getting clean. She went into a treatment program and stayed sober for the entire pregnancy. We talked about getting married and raising you together, and for a few months it seemed like everything was going to work out. But then your father found out about the drugs? Thomas nodded. He had been having me followed because he suspected something was going on. When he confronted me with the evidence, I told him the truth about Jennifer's addiction and my involvement. I thought he would understand that I had been trying to help someone I loved. Instead, he used it to break you up. He told me that if I didn't end the relationship immediately, he would turn the evidence over to the police and I would go to prison. He said that Jennifer would be prosecuted too, and that you would end up in foster care while both of your parents served time for drug-related charges. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. So he blackmailed you? Yes, but I also believed he was right about the consequences. I was terrified that my mistakes would destroy Jennifer's chance at recovery, and your chance at a normal life. So I agreed to his terms. What were the terms? Thomas's voice became bitter. I had to end all contact with Jennifer immediately. I had to agree to the adoption without fighting it. And I had to promise never to try to find you or have any contact with you. In exchange, he would make sure that no charges were filed against either of us. But Jennifer didn't know about the blackmail? No. My father told her that I had decided I didn't want the responsibility of a wife and child, that I had chosen my family's wealth and status over her and the baby. She believed that I had abandoned her voluntarily. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she imagined the pain and betrayal Jennifer must have felt. So she left the reservation thinking that you had rejected her and your own child. Yes. And I let her believe it because my father convinced me that it was better for everyone if she hated me. He said it would help her move on and build a new life. What about the FBI investigation William mentioned? Thomas looked surprised. What FBI investigation? Your father said that Jennifer was under investigation for drug trafficking and that he made a deal with federal agents to keep you both out of prison. Thomas shook his head. There was no FBI investigation. Jennifer's ex-boyfriend was eventually arrested by local police, but Jennifer was never charged with anything. My father lied to you about that. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together for Sarah, and the picture they formed was uglier than she had imagined. William Crowfeather hadn't been protecting his family from scandal or legal trouble. He had been protecting his control over his son and his vision for the family's future. He's been lying to all of us for 18 years. Sarah said. Yes, Thomas agreed. And the worst part is that I let him. I was so scared and confused that I believed everything he told me. I thought I was protecting you and Jennifer by staying away, but really I was just taking the easy way out. They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about the waste and tragedy of the past 18 years. Finally, Sarah spoke. What do we do now? Do we tell Jennifer the truth? Do we try to find her? Thomas had clearly been thinking about the same questions. I've been trying to find Jennifer for the past 2 weeks, ever since you and I started meeting. I hired a private investigator and we located her in Portland. She's married to a good man, has 2 other children, and seems to have built a stable, happy life. Have you contacted her? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first to see how you felt about the possibility of reaching out to her. Sarah considered this carefully. I want to meet her, but I also don't want to disrupt her life if she's happy. Maybe we could approach her carefully. Let her know that I exist and that I'd like to have some kind of relationship if she's interested. I think that's wise, Thomas agreed. But there's something else we need to consider. If we contact Jennifer, and if she's willing to tell her side of the story, it could expose all of my father's lies. That might have consequences for the family business and his reputation in the community. Are you worried about protecting him after everything he's done? Thomas thought about this for a moment. I'm not worried about protecting him, but I am worried about the other people who could be hurt. The ranch employs a lot of people who depend on those jobs. My father has made donations and commitments to tribal programs that could be affected if his reputation is damaged. Sarah understood his dilemma, but she also felt that the truth needed to come out. Thomas, your father has spent 18 years controlling people through lies and manipulation. How many other families has he torn apart? How many other young people has he intimidated into making decisions that weren't in their best interests? You're right, Thomas said. I can't keep protecting a system that caused so much pain. As the sun began to set over the lake, Sarah and Thomas made plans for moving forward. They would contact Jennifer together, tell her the truth about what had happened 18 years ago, and invite her to be part of a relationship that had been stolen from all of them by fear and lies. They also agreed that they would no longer hide their relationship from William or anyone else. They were both adults and they had the right to know each other regardless of his approval or disapproval. Are you prepared for his reaction? Thomas asked as they walked back to their cars. Are you? Sarah countered. Thomas smiled for the first time since their conversation began. I've been preparing for this confrontation for 18 years. I think it's time I stood up to him and took responsibility for my own life. As Sarah drove home that evening, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since the day she first opened her adoption records. The dangerous secret was finally fully revealed. And while the truth was painful and complicated, it was also liberating. She now understood that her birth parents had loved her and each other, that they had been separated by manipulation rather than choice, and that there was still time to build the relationships that should have existed all along. The next phase of her journey would involve confronting William Crowfeather and his decades of control, reaching out to Jennifer to offer healing and reconciliation, and helping Thomas find the courage to reclaim his own life. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since she began searching for her origins, Sarah felt confident that she was fighting for something worth the struggle. The girl who had started this journey as an innocent 18-year-old seeking answers about her past was now a young woman ready to fight for her future, and the futures of the people she had learned to love. The patriarch's veiled secret had been exposed, and the truth, however painful, had finally set them all free to make their own choices about who they wanted to be and how they wanted to live.